Hey guys, so this week I'm going to be focusing on filters, and I'm going to show you how to make some sound effects and how to do a lot of actually really cool things with filters. I'll show you how to make a series of drums from one filter, and how to make, ocean and wind sound effects, and I think I just figured out how to make horse hoof sound effects as well, and as well as how to get some string sounds out of just a noise source, VCA, and a delay. So starting out here, I want to talk about filters. So we have your basic VC, VRAC, VCF, and it has two outputs, a low pass filter output and a high pass filter output. And so of course the low pass filter filters out the high stuff and lets the low pass through. And the high pass filter filters out the low stuff and lets the low pass through. And those are really common types of filters. You'll see them in EQs all the time. But whenever you combine them together, you create what's called a bandpass filter, which is just allowing a certain range of frequencies to pass through. And using a bandpass filter, you can get a lot of really cool effects. So I want to start with a noise source right here, putting it into this VCF, and I'll use the high pass filter out into a second VCF, and then you use the low pass filter out. So I have both a low pass and a high pass engaged. So the low pass, as you know, when you open it up, sound comes through. But the high pass is different. But the high pass works differently. As you move up, it filters out things. So to create a bandpass filter, we'll have a high pass filter set really low, and then a low pass filter set sort of at a medium low setting, so that we're cutting out a frequency range. So I've taken this 8-vert over here, and whenever you have nothing in an 8-vert, and you move the dial around, you send out a control voltage. You see over there on the scope how the pink voltage is moving up and down. That's me controlling it with this knob. So you can set up an 8-vert. 8-vert is a sort of control surface, digital control surface inside. And so I've set up the top dial to control the frequency of the filter, and I've set the second knob to control the resonance. I'm going to add a little bit of drive because the high pass filter tends to soften things. So let's check out what happens when I move the filter around. Typical sort of sound effect sound, and depending on where you set how wide your filter is, you'll get different timbres. But I want a fairly wide bandpass. Now, if we take an LFO and use an LFO to control that, a fairly slow one, with just a small amount of CV coming through. you get sort of an ocean wave sound effect. Now, if you add some resonance to that, you get a traditional wind sound effect. That's the sine wave coming off of the filter. If you noticed, I'm not using any envelopes on this yet. That's just continuously coming out. Now, if I decide I want to make something percussive out of this, you can get some really cool effects. So, you know, akin to something you'd hear on a Pink Floyd record. Or maybe Tangerine Dream. But then I'll change up the rhythm. And we're starting to get a sort of a horse hoof sound effect. And what I did over here is you can select which gates are active on the sequencer. Just created a horse hoof pattern. And you can also create like some cool hi-hats this way. A lot of different percussion can come out of this, just tweaking the knobs. You know, add drive if you want more bottom end. Cool. So that's noise with a bandpass filter. What if we threw an oscillator in there instead? Something harmonically rich like a square wave. The more resonance you have, the more bubbly it's going to sound. And of course, the envelope is going to really affect it. And now we have almost a cricket sound effect. With a medium attack and low everything else. The square wave. And by changing the pulse width of the square wave, we have more of a frog sound. So now what I've done is I've created two bandpass filters in order to create one to cover the lower spectrum of a sound and one to cover the higher spectrum of a sound. That way, whenever I add resonance to each filter, it can accentuate different aspects of the sound and get some really unique timbres this way. So what I did is I took a saw wave and I split it into multiple parts and put one through one bandpass filter and another copy through the second bandpass filter. And as you can see, I have it set up high pass, low pass, high pass, low pass, and I have this bandpass filter on the left here set up to cover the lower spectrum, and this one over here covered to set up the higher spectrum. Now the reason I used a multiple instead of just stacking the cables is to illustrate a point that whenever you're working with actual hardware, audio signals tend to lose serious amounts of amplitude whenever you just stack cables and make copies of them that way. So you need to use something called a buffered multiple, which most systems will have, where you take a audio signal and you make copies of it in order just to maintain the signal strength. So I'm going to show you the first half of the bandpass filter. As you notice, it doesn't go all the way up to the top of the spectrum. I've lowered the CV respondency so it doesn't get too high, because then it would sort of trample on the range of the second bandpass filter. But let's listen to this bandpass filter with some resonance. A little bit more. Now that almost sounds like an analog sound, because we have two filters there just on the lower half to create the bandpass. There are units that have bandpass filters built in. That's actually more common. But we're driving the resonance of each filter. So each cutoff point, the lower and the higher, are both resonating. And that's creating these really nice and rich harmonics that are coming out. So let's listen to the higher filter. First with no resonance. And then with some resonance. Now together. You can almost hear a chord there. Let's try to tune it. I don't know about you, but I love the way this sounds. But I might be a bit biased. My favorite filter in my analog system is called the Three Sisters. And it's a filter that has 4 inputs and 4 outputs. It has inputs for the low pass, high pass, and bandpass filters that are all separate filters inside the module. And then an input that goes into all of them at once, and outputs for all those as well. As far as having control over the frequency and the resonance, it also has sort of like a negative feedback resonance that enforces the lower spectrum. It also has a control over how far apart the filters are from each other. And it creates sounds just like what you just heard, and it's fantastic. I love putting sometimes my entire mix through it. Often. But it has sort of a throaty quality about it that's almost vocal. Makes me think of chanting. Now let's see what that sounds like with an envelope. And I'm going to put an envelope right in here. And we can have a negative envelope pulling the filters down. And elongating the fall times on the envelope because I want to hear those harmonics. Let's see what this sounds like with a melodic line put in. And you can adjust the positions of the filters. And now an LFO is controlling the resonance amount. And sort of an evolving patch. So if the filters cross over, you'll start to get some mid-range phasing, which can be nice or undesirable, depending on what you're trying to do. What I'm doing here, playing the delays, is the reason my modular system has 2 delay units in it. Just the change of motion and time and the colors you can create with a delay are amazing, and a performance of their own right. and all the rhythms you can create just by moving the time knob. Or if you're trying to do a voiceover, you can create greater separation between the two and leave the middle range open to talk over. So I took the same circuit we were just playing with on that last patch with the bandpass filters, and I'm using a bandpass filter here. But instead of sending noise into it or an oscillator, I'm sending an envelope here. The envelope is going into the input signal to ping the filter. I am also sending that into the frequency to move the filters up and then down. Let's hear this, the up and then down you're hearing. And it's also controlling the volume at the end here. And I'm still controlling the resonance of each filter with the attenuverter over here. But essentially what I've done is create a 808 kick drum circuit. And you can tune it. You can use the envelope to determine its shape and length. You can change the characteristics by altering the resonance and the drive. But it will need some resonance to actually work because we're using the self-resonating aspect of the filter to create the sine waves of the kick. And so you'd use the low-pass filter to control the top end of it. You know, how much of the envelope is it getting? How bright do you want it to be? And then the other filter to control the bottom end. It's all about tuning it and finding the sweet spots. I bet we could create a wide variety of drums out of a bandpass filter and an envelope. Let's try to make a different sound. And remember that these knobs right here, the Freak CV, should be an attenuator itself, so it should be off at noon. Positive to the right of that, and negative the other way. And use the drive to determine how much resonance of each filter is coming through. The more drive you have, the less resonance of that filter will come through. And so now we have more of a tom sound just by tweaking it. But the tom sound is more about the envelope. You see, with the long envelope and different filter settings, it sounds more like an 808, but toms are more percussive. I'd say even less drive, because we don't want to drive the toms too hard. There, that's more of a tom sound. Less drive, shorter envelope, less movement in the filter itself, so lower frequency CV. Ooh, that's pretty good. Now we could use the sequencer over here to affect the drums. So we could control the release with the first row. So I want the first two short, and then medium, and then another short one. Maybe the first one should be longer as well. And you could use the second row to control another aspect. Let's say the drive of the first channel. See, and that has a lot of life in it. It's not the same sound, exactly the same timbre every time. It's different. It's got a nice pattern to it. And that sort of modulation is just a really nice way to add more life to your patch. The more sound evolves, typically the more interesting it is to listen to for long periods of time. That does have a bell curve though, so too much evolution too quickly can get grating, drive you a bit nuts. So that's a nice way to make a variety of drums with a filter there. And we talked about noise through a bandpass filter, hi-hats, that sort of evolved. And then we did 808 kick drums and toms. And talked about using multiple bandpass filters over a oscillator signal. But really, any signal, like put an entire drum patch through a couple bandpass filters covering different parts and move them around. It'll really accentuate things and make it sound very interesting. So the last thing I want to talk about today is called the Carplus Strong technique. And it's a way to make plucked string sounds using just an envelope, a noise source, a delay unit, and 2 VCAs. And I guess that does sound complicated when you say it that way. When you say it honestly, it's like, yeah, it sounds like a guitar, but you're using like 6 modules to do it. It sounds cool. So we're going to do it. So the way that it works is we take a noise source. So here's the VCV rack noise source, and it has a bunch of different types of noise. The difference between the noises is the algorithm used to create them, but what really matters is the harmonic content within them. White noise is exactly the same signal strength across the spectrum, whereas things like pink and red noise, they have more noise in the lower frequencies than the higher, to sort of emulate the way humans hear, because we hear more in the mid frequencies than we do in the lows and the highs. So it's more of a comfortable noise to listen to. That could be an album title, a comfortable noise to listen to. All right, so we start with the white noise. And then we put it through a VCA. And then we use an envelope to open that, right? And we're going to use just a decay envelope. So it sounds like this. And then we're going to put that through a delay. But with a really high mix. If you have a really fast delay, it's almost like an oscillator because it's playing the sound over and over again, the same way an oscillator plays a shape over and over again. And depending on how fast your delay time is, the closer together the sounds are. So it's like higher and lower frequency oscillator tones. So if we put that through another VCA, we'll use the decay knob to control how much noise is going in. You want a high feedback to get this really nice bright tone. Or if you don't, then you don't. Depends on what you're going for. And then use the color knob to shape the high end. And you want a high mix as well. So by tuning the time, we can get different notes. I don't think this will track a volt per octave. There are units out there like rings and 2HP pluck, which will in hardware format, that are just dedicated to doing Carplus Strong. But But let's try this. Doesn't look like that's going to work. So let's try to use the attenuverter instead. And we can find where the right signal strength is. As you can imagine, this sounds nice through a filter and some delay. You can turn down the time to tune the whole thing. So that's it for this week. I didn't want to overload you guys with too much because I know you're working on your projects. And speaking of which, I won't be putting out a lecture next week because I'll be grading all the projects. Also, this weekend from Friday to Monday, I will be unreachable as I'm taking part in a large game jam, the Ludum Dare. So I will be hooked up to my computer and writing code for 72 hours straight, and I will not be here. But if you need anything, email me anyways, and I'll probably check my email and do my best to get back to you. Because I have problems saying no to people. It's a big issue in my life. All right. Well, hope you guys have learned a lot and are having a great time. We're almost to midterm. And so after the grading and we come back, I'll cover video synthesis and talk about that. And then we'll dive even deeper into audio modular.